From iPhone OS 1.0 all the way back in 2007 to iOS 7 in 2013 to the Liquid Glass update with iOS 26, Apple has changed and refined their mobile software a lot over the years, with plenty of ups and downs along the way. And yet, there have been very few updates that have been specifically built to improve your iPhone experience, past just adding new features or making the software look prettier. In contrast, iOS 27 is an update set to bring a few new additions beyond Siri AI, but that's not a bad thing by any means, as Apple is instead focusing on improving the user experience and performance, particularly on older iPhones. This won't make for the most exciting of iOS releases, and you won't see all that much hype for it, but I can say with confidence that Apple seems to be heading in the right direction here, and that iOS 27 has the potential to be the best iOS update we've seen in years. And I can say this because Apple's done it before, and it resulted in quite possibly the smoothest, most reliable, and perhaps even greatest iOS release of all time.
You guessed it, iOS 12.
Announced June 2018 at WWDC and officially released that fall around the time of the iPhone XS, XS Max, and iPhone XR launch, iOS 12 came with the aim of speeding up older iPhones and stabilizing the software experience. There are actually a lot of parallels with iOS 27. 27 is an update coming off a couple really buggy years with iOS 18 and 26, whereas iOS 12 was coming off the absolute mess that was iOS 11. These are updates that add barely anything new and don't feature major redesigns or overhauls, but what they're trying to do is fix what Apple has broken. And not necessarily just in terms of bugs, many of the new AI features are basically what we were promised 2 years ago with Apple Intelligence and iOS 18. iOS 27 supports old iPhones all the way back to the 2019 iPhone 11 and 11 Pro, and likewise, iOS 12 also supported every iPhone that ran the previous version, including the 2013 iPhone 5S, which I would argue was a feat significantly more impressive given how limited mobile hardware was when the 5S released, whereas by 2019, phones had much faster specs and were far better set up to age well in the future. While the iPhone 5S had the A7 chipset and was the first smartphone with a 64-bit architecture, it was still limited to only a single gigabyte of RAM, just like the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus from 2014, phones that would also end their lives on iOS 12. But that was fine, because iOS 12 was about the best possible version for these phones to be stuck forever on. We live in an age today where smartphones shouldn't ever really get too unbearably slow with time. They do slow down, of course, but we're far past the point of them feeling basically unusable, like we saw especially with the iPhone 4S on iOS 9, which was so bad it resulted in a class action lawsuit. The iPhone 11 was expected to end its life on iOS 26, and honestly that wouldn't have been great because iOS 26 is kind of buggy and doesn't perform great on the iPhone 11, but I don't think it's so bad it could ever result in a lawsuit. You can only expect so much from these older smartphones as they age, and there always seems to be a trade-off when you update, where your phone often gets a bit slower, but at least you're getting new features and are up to date. And that's sort of the unspoken agreement between Apple and the users. There is a certain level of trust you need to have in Apple to continually update your phone every year. If Apple's going to support their iPhones for far longer than the competition, as they historically have, they have an innate obligation to keep your experience smooth and reliable, at least within reason. If you're installing a new update, the inherent assumption is that your phone will be getting better, never worse, especially considering you don't really have much choice in these updates, as Apple will pester you until you finally give in. And once you do, there's no going back, as Apple quickly stops assigning old versions, making it impossible to downgrade. Now I say this because it's part of the reason why iOS 12 was so great. It marked a bit of a turning point in how old iPhones tended to age. Looking back, very few early iPhones performed reasonably well on their final updates. The first two generations would chug, and then the iPhone 3GS actually did end up shockingly fast on iOS 6 thanks to how well optimized the software was. Then the iPhone 4 was slow on iOS 7, and then the iPhone 4S was very slow on iOS 8 before slowing down to a painstaking crawl on iOS 9. Seriously, Apple absolutely ruined that iPhone. Then the iPhone 5 and 5C made it to iOS 10 and performed much better thanks to having more RAM. Using these phones wasn't pleasant per se, but it wasn't all that bad, and going into 2017, the stage was set for the next generation on the chopping block, the iPhone 5S, to receive what would very likely be its final major update. And then we would end up with quite possibly the worst iOS update of all time. Constant crashes and glitches, opening an app and being met with a blank white screen, if the app even opened to begin with. Stuttery animations, the keyboard taking 13 years to activate, autocorrect often being incorrect, the phone lagging when you're typing, lagging with multitasking, lagging when you're doing literally anything, changes to the now merged lock screen and notification center causing confusion, dumbification of the control center, poor battery life, a single letter from an Indian language literally causing your entire device to boot loop. Yes, this really was a thing, and it affected more devices than just iPhones. iOS 18 and iOS 26 have had their fair share of problems, to be sure, but iOS 11 is the absolute poster child of terrible software releases. It was disastrous and threatened to completely undermine Apple's hard-earned reputation of maintaining a reliable, consistent, and stable experience. iPhones were supposed to be easy. It was all supposed to just work, but for some users, iOS 11 barely functioned. It's important to set the stage leading up to iOS 12 because the context really makes it clear why this update was so vital and so great. There was a lot of reasons why iOS 11 had its issues, and I think the big one is that in 2017, Apple released the iPhone X, a vast departure from previous models as it dropped the home button completely, bringing an edge-to-edge display and notch. This iPhone put Apple's software team in a precarious position leading up to its launch. There was now a lot riding on iOS 11. This phone required support for the new aspect ratio, for the notch for Face ID, and emoji, and most critically, it needed an entirely new navigation system. And at least on the surface, it kinda seemed like Apple nailed it. I mean, the gesture navigation worked really well. It made logical sense, swiping up from the bottom had this distinct flow to it. It all really felt like iOS in a way that just can't be replicated on other platforms. But this was still a whole lot to bring for one single version of iOS, and it led to a lot of things falling through the cracks along the way. Things like general stability and quality assurance. iOS 11 would end up being one of, if not just straight up, the buggiest software releases we've ever seen from Apple. As an early iPhone X owner myself, I can say it was rough, but I also actually had it pretty good, because after all, iOS 11 was specifically built for this new iPhone, and it was the older iPhones that really suffered, with all of the bugs and none of the real benefits that came with the updated software. My personal theory has always been that Apple originally never intended to release the iPhone X in 2017, but ultimately decided to rush it by a year in order to stay competitive within the industry. The iPhone X was delayed to November, despite the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus coming out in September. It had limited availability for months onwards, and of course iOS 11 felt in many ways half-baked. There's also the fact that iOS 10 had brought this new redesigned control center compared to iOS 9, which I personally always liked, and yet iOS 11 changed everything up only a year later. And why? Well, because they had to. This control center simply wouldn't have worked if you needed to pull it down from the top right corner of the screen instead of from the bottom. So now we had to get a completely new control center, yet another big addition to iOS 11, which as a whole served as a minor visual overhaul with some new icons, App Store redesign, and the notification center being merged with the lock screen, plus a whole lot more. iOS 11, even without all of the necessary features being added for the sake of Apple's newest iPhone, would have been a pretty large release. So throw in gesture navigation and everything else on top of that? Well, it's a lot to expect from only 1 year of work. Now, my personal theory that the iPhone X was rushed a year, that could be completely wrong, and maybe Apple always intended for it to go this way to release in 2017. But if anything, it makes everything look so much worse for Apple to allow an update this buggy to ever happen. Plus, it does feel odd to see that redesigned control center in iOS 10 only for 1 year before it gets overhauled again. And that new control center in iOS 11, like many things, needed more time in the oven. Some functionality was heavily reliant on 3D touch, something many iPhones didn't have, and it also introduced the whole turning off Wi-Fi doesn't actually turn off your Wi-Fi thing, which really annoyed a lot of users. It all felt poorly thought out and ill-conceived, which really can be said about the entire update as a whole. And of course, again, it's the oldest iPhones that suffered the most. iOS 11 was naturally going to be at its slowest and most painful on old iPhones like the 5S, and it was pretty darn depressing to think that it was going to be the final version for the 2013 flagship, at least until Apple, against all odds, blew us away with the announcement of iOS 12 at WWDC 18.
We're working top to bottom, making improvements to make your device faster and more responsive. And because we want these changes to be available to the full range of our customers, iOS 12 will be available on all the same devices as iOS 11.
Firstly, I have to laugh a bit about Apple talking about the satisfaction numbers regarding iOS 11.
And we're thrilled to report that customer sat for iOS 11 is at 95%.
I'm guessing this was in direct response to much of the criticism against them at the time. Like, hey guys, look, people do love us actually, and you're just wrong if you think otherwise. But also, yeah, okay, fine, iOS 12 is gonna fix all the problems that definitely don't exist and make iOS actually good again. And wouldn't you know it, it kinda did. And thankfully, no user was gonna miss out.
And we're focusing our efforts especially on the oldest devices. And while it's still early days, we're really pleased with some of the results we're seeing.
iOS 12 was an entirely unique update in all of iOS history to this point. There were some new features, but they were never the core of what this release was. For the last year, Apple's users had suffered on a broken, sometimes unusable iOS 11 experience. For them to address this directly, even if it came with them posturing about their allegedly stellar customer satisfaction rates, it was also crucial in regaining trust and finally breaking this toxic update cycle we had come to expect. With every year came a new iOS update that would slow down your phone, but people would tolerate it because it came with some new cool features. Plus, Apple would keep hassling you until you updated your device. And then, generally speaking, the oldest iPhone wouldn't get this update at all. It would be unsupported. Or if it did get the update, it would get even slower. This was the opposite case with iOS 12, with every device supported by iOS 11 getting the update. And while there were only a handful of new features to look forward to, for the first time, old iPhones actually got faster. This wasn't just a first for Apple, I would wager it was a first for the entire smartphone industry. Not only did most Android manufacturers not bother to update their phones for more than 2 years back in the day, if even that, but you would rarely, if ever, see them put in any effort to actually improve the experience on their older devices past the bare minimum. And I mean, why would they? There is an active incentive for companies not to do this, because the slower your phone, the sooner you'll feel the need to buy a new one. Planned obsolescence is a real thing, and Apple could certainly be accused of it in the past, but iOS 12 was the opposite. Your old phone may never feel quite as fast as it once was, but it suddenly felt usable again.
This is the iPhone 6 Plus. Now on that device, iOS 12 delivers a number of improvements across common operations. You'll see that apps launch up to 40% faster. The keyboard can come up to 50% faster, and you can slide to take a photo at up to 70% faster.
These were some massive speed increases over iOS 11 and dramatically improved the overall feel of older iPhones. They might seem like small things, but the difference between, say, your keyboard taking a full second to open versus maybe a half second, that is substantial, especially when you extrapolate that over hundreds and even thousands of keyboard activations over time. Now, this wasn't a perfect update. For example, some users reported that battery life was noticeably worse, as the smoother performance came with more power consumption. Even so, you were still getting that smoother performance. I feel like most iOS updates bring worse battery life as it is anyways, so at least this time you're getting something out of it. The effort and resources put in by Apple's software team had paid off big time, and this was evident right from the day one beta, which I remember testing for myself back in the day. I even have old footage of it on my iPhone 5S. Right out of the gate, it was running surprisingly well, easily better than iOS 11. And of course, there was more to iOS 12 than just the performance improvements, even if that was by and far the best aspect of it. iOS 12 would see the introduction of Siri shortcuts, which was a great addition. You also saw screen time, Memoji, the Measure app, and a bunch of ARKit upgrades, more Do Not Disturb options, notification grouping, which was huge. Oh, and group FaceTime calling came out with iOS 12.1, that was cool, and there were plenty more small things. But all of this to me was background noise. The faster speeds and support going back to the 5-year-old iPhone 5S, that's what I was really interested in. And for those on newer iPhones, it's not as if you weren't feeling these improvements. Sure, my iPhone 10 had already been plenty fast on iOS 11, but there were also a lot of bugs and incongruencies that I had to deal with. By the time iOS 12 rolled around and I bought myself an iPhone XS, much of this was already fixed, or would be soon. Most developers had updated their apps for the new aspect ratio by this point, and gone were the black bars on the top and bottom of the screen that I remember having early on. The experience as a whole was a lot more stable, and hey, I remember really liking that wallpaper too. I still think it's one of my favorites of any they've ever released. I certainly wouldn't want to live on iOS 12 anymore. It doesn't hold up well in 2026, lots of apps won't work on it, right? Dark mode didn't come until iOS 13, and so 12 is definitely a no-go for me. I need my dark mode. But the quality of the software on display here cannot be denied, and it's made even more evident by the fact that Apple is continuing to maintain it today, even if infrequently. Its most recent update was iOS 12.5.8, hitting January 2026. It was a very minor release that extended expiring certificates to ensure continued functionality of features like iMessage, FaceTime, and device activation. But the fact that Apple cares enough to release an update for a smartphone that came out in 2013, instead of just letting it rot and forcing any old users to upgrade to something newer, yeah, that's pretty cool, and it's something only Apple would do. iOS updates these days often feel to me like they're setting up for future releases, like they're bringing pieces of a larger puzzle that Apple intends to fill in later on, if that makes sense. iOS 14 brought widgets, iOS 16 brought lock screen customizability, iOS 18 brought home screen customizability, and iOS 26 brought the liquid glass interface. All along the way, the focus on performance and optimization has seemed to dissipate, until finally, this year, Apple seems to not only be fixing their broken promises with Apple Intelligence, but also fixing their software at large. When I make the claim that iOS 12 is quite possibly the greatest iOS update Apple has ever released, I'm not so much talking about this specific version of software itself, as I am what it represented and how it fundamentally focused on improving the user experience. Again, you wouldn't want to use iOS 12 today, but given the context of when this came out and what it was replacing with the disastrous iOS 11, I mean, I don't know if Apple's ever 180 quite as hard as they did with iOS 12. There have been far more exciting, feature-packed updates. iOS 7 comes to mind as probably the most hyped of all time, and even in recent years, we've seen plenty of updates that feel a lot more substantial than iOS 12 ever did. If anything, iOS 12 was basically like iOS 11.5, a continuation, but that's what made it so great. Apple had a decent foundation with iOS 11, but they needed to take their time to fix things, to listen to user feedback, and make our experience better. The effort to support so many iPhones and iPads, the fact that Apple is still giving iOS 12 essential security updates all these years later, the fact that as the final version for the iPhone 5S, iPhone 6, and 6 Plus, it actually runs pretty darn well, this was Apple at their best, putting the user experience of all of their users at the forefront, including those on older devices. And it's also worth pointing out again that Apple stopped supporting the iPhone 6 and the 5S at the same time, despite the 5S coming out a year earlier. They could have left the iPhone 5S back on iOS 11. It would have been maybe a better look, and it certainly would have been expected, but they knew they could give the 5S the update. And so they did, even though they knew it meant the iPhone 6 wouldn't get as many years of updates as the 5S did. And I respect the boldness of that decision. It's something Apple had never done before. The focus on older devices, the focus on performance, it's something I feel Apple's been failing to do in more recent years, with iOS 18 and iOS 26 feeling buggy to even myself, having used like an iPhone 15 Pro Max and an iPhone 17 Pro, some of the newest iPhones available. It's always going to be the older iPhones that feel it the worst. So to see this year iOS 27 finally trying to fix all that, just like how iOS 12 was exactly what we needed at the exact right time, I'm hopeful iOS 27 will be the same thing. Now, while it's hard for me to imagine iOS 27 ultimately being anywhere near as amazing as iOS 12 was, Apple certainly seems to be on the right track so far. And so if you'd like to see my video talking about iOS 27, I'll have that linked in the description below, because I think for now we're right about done here. If you enjoyed this walk down memory lane, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. It's hard for me to imagine this video doing too well, given it's kind of a weird topic, iOS 12. I mean, who's thought about iOS 12 in however many years? But I think it's worth remembering because it really is one of Apple's best updates, and I love it when they focus on their legacy users. It's something other companies just don't really seem to do to the same extent. So iOS 27 beta is looking good so far. We'll see how it pans out when it releases this fall. Thank you all so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.